Everyone believes they are good at recognizing dangerous people. We imagine manipulation coming from loud voices, open hostility, or obvious control. But the truth is far more unsettling. The most effective manipulators rarely look dangerous at all. They look helpful. They listen patiently when others speak. They remember the small details about your life that most people forget. And slowly, almost invisibly, they begin shaping the way you see the people around you. Imagine trusting someone completely. Someone who listens to your problems, remembers your fears, and always seems to understand you better than anyone else. Then imagine discovering that every word they spoke, every question they asked, was quietly reshaping your life in ways you never noticed. In one quiet American town, something like this began happening years ago. Friendships that once felt unbreakable started falling apart. Couples who trusted each other suddenly questioned everything. Long-standing relationships collapsed without anyone clearly understanding why. And strangely, the same person always seemed to be nearby when the confusion began. People described this person as calm, thoughtful, even compassionate. No one ever accused them of causing problems. In fact, many trusted them more than anyone else. Yet when former friends later compared their stories, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Each conflict had begun with a conversation. Each doubt had started with a quiet suggestion. Each broken relationship traced back to the same voice offering gentle advice. What began as simple conversations slowly turned into something much more complicated. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, years of trust had already been rewritten by a series of carefully placed ideas. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of how one quiet mind game changed everything. Her name was Claire. In the small town where these strange events unfolded, Claire was known as someone people trusted without hesitation. She spoke calmly, listened carefully, and rarely raised her voice even during difficult conversations. Friends often described her as thoughtful, the kind of person who always seemed willing to sit quietly and hear someone out when life felt complicated. When neighbors talked about her, they usually mentioned the same qualities. She was patient, considerate, and unusually attentive to other people's struggles. That reputation made what happened next far more confusing, because over the next 3 years something began changing among the people closest to Claire. Friendships that had lasted decades started weakening in ways no one could clearly explain. Couples who once seemed stable found themselves arguing about things that previously never caused tension. In some cases, partners began questioning each other's loyalty, even though nothing concrete had actually happened. At first, most people dismissed these problems as normal disagreements. Every relationship experiences stress from time to time. But as months passed, the same unsettling pattern appeared again and again. People who once trusted each other deeply now felt uncertain about conversations they remembered differently. A few former friends later said they began feeling like their entire understanding of certain events had slowly shifted. And as these stories continued to surface, a troubling set of questions emerged. Were these conflicts simply coincidences that happened to unfold within the same social circle? Was Claire simply someone people trusted so deeply that they shared their worries with her more than anyone else? Or had something else been happening quietly within those conversations people remembered so clearly? Because when investigators and former friends eventually started comparing their experiences side by side, they began noticing something that none of them had recognized at the time. The same type of conversations appeared again and again. The same doubts seemed to emerge in similar ways. And gradually a pattern began revealing itself that was impossible to ignore. Claire did not stand out in the way people often expect from someone who later becomes the center of a complicated story. She was not aggressive, and she rarely spoke loudly, even when conversations became emotional. In most situations, Claire appeared calm and composed, someone who preferred listening rather than competing for attention in a room. Friends often said she had a quiet presence that made people feel comfortable sharing things they normally kept private. Over time, many people in her social circle noticed the same pattern. When a conversation began, Claire usually asked a few gentle questions and then allowed the other person to speak. She had an unusual skill that people later remembered clearly. She listened more than she spoke. That simple habit created a powerful effect. During long evenings with friends or quiet talks over coffee, People often found themselves explaining their worries in detail, while Claire sat patiently across from them. Someone might describe tension with a partner, another might mention frustrations at work, and Claire would nod thoughtfully while absorbing every word. What seemed like ordinary conversations often lasted for hours, and the people speaking rarely realized how much personal information they were sharing in those moments. Psychologists have often noted that people reveal their insecurities surprisingly quickly when they believe someone is genuinely interested in understanding them. Claire seemed to understand this instinct naturally. She rarely interrupted anyone, and she asked questions that felt thoughtful and sincere. Sometimes she would ask someone who they trusted the most in their life. At other times, she might ask whether anyone had disappointed them recently or whether they ever felt people took advantage of their kindness. None of these questions appeared unusual on their own. In fact, they often sounded supportive, the kind of conversation many people appreciate when they feel stressed or uncertain about something happening in their lives. To most people, Claire seemed compassionate, someone who simply cared enough to listen carefully when others needed to talk. Yet when investigators later examined these conversations more closely, they began noticing something important about the way Claire interacted with people. Those long discussions were not just moments of empathy. For Claire, they were something else entirely. Each confession someone shared, every fear they admitted, every frustration they described quietly revealed how they viewed the people around them. Over time, those conversations created a detailed understanding of the relationships within that small town, and Claire remembered far more of those details than anyone realized at the time. To Claire, those conversations were not simply acts of kindness. They were information. And once someone understands another person's fears and doubts, influencing the way they interpret events becomes surprisingly easy. The first signs of Claire's influence were so subtle that no one recognized them as anything unusual. She never accused anyone directly, and she never tried to convince people that someone else had done something wrong. Instead, Claire relied on something far more effective. She asked questions. During conversations with friends, she often spoke in a calm and careful tone, choosing words that sounded almost hesitant. Someone might be explaining a recent disagreement when Claire would pause briefly before saying something like, "I might be wrong, but did you notice how she spoke to you earlier?" The question sounded harmless. In fact, it often sounded supportive, as though Claire was simply helping someone think through a situation that already felt confusing. Yet questions like that had a powerful effect on the human mind. When someone hears an accusation, they can reject it immediately. But when someone hears a question, the mind begins searching for answers. Psychologists have long observed that questions trigger imagination in ways statements cannot. Once a person begins replaying a conversation in their memory, they start noticing details that previously felt insignificant. A short pause during a conversation might suddenly seem suspicious. A neutral comment might sound disrespectful when remembered from a different angle. Claire understood that people naturally fill gaps in their understanding with their own interpretations. She did not need to create a story. She only needed to introduce a possibility and allow the other person's thoughts to build the rest. Over time, these small questions appeared in different conversations across the same circle of friends. One person might leave a discussion with Claire feeling uncertain about something their partner had said. Another might begin wondering whether a friend had been hiding resentment. None of these thoughts seemed extreme at first, yet they slowly changed the way people interpreted ordinary interactions. Conversations that once felt comfortable now carried an undercurrent of tension. Friends began noticing things they had previously ignored. Small misunderstandings grew into longer arguments. Some relationships entered quiet periods of distance as people tried to make sense of feelings they could not fully explain. What made the situation even more confusing was that Claire never appeared responsible for the conflict. She rarely repeated accusations, and she often encouraged people to stay calm when emotions rose. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen her offering thoughtful advice, while others argued among themselves. That detail later became one of the most important insights investigators uncovered. Claire never created the conflict herself. She simply introduced the doubt that allowed conflict to grow. And once doubt enters a relationship, it rarely stays contained. The mind begins searching for confirmation everywhere, replaying past conversations, and examining every new interaction for signs that something might be wrong. In that way, a single suggestion can quietly reshape the way two people see each other. And as months passed within that small American town, more people found themselves questioning relationships they once believed were unshakable. What none of them realized yet was that the same pattern had begun unfolding across several different friendships. Each person believed their concerns had formed naturally. Each person believed they were simply noticing things they had overlooked before. But once doubt entered those relationships, people began looking for evidence everywhere. As the months continued passing, the quiet tension spreading through Claire's circle of friends began turning into something more visible. Conversations that once felt easy started ending with frustration. Friends who used to meet regularly now spoke less often. Some friendships faded almost overnight, leaving people confused about how disagreements had grown so large so quickly. In several cases, couples who had been together for years began arguing about small misunderstandings that suddenly seemed impossible to resolve. One partner might remember a conversation one way, while the other insisted something entirely different had been said. The more they tried to explain their perspectives, the more uncertain the situation became. Even outside of personal relationships, similar tensions began appearing in workplaces and social groups. Co-workers who had trusted each other for years started questioning motives behind ordinary decisions. A short message from a colleague might feel abrupt or dismissive. Someone arriving late to a meeting might be interpreted as disrespectful rather than accidental. None of these incidents seemed dramatic by themselves, yet together they created a steady atmosphere of suspicion. As these conflicts grew, one person remained consistently present in the middle of these conversations: Claire. When people felt confused about a disagreement, they often reached out to her first. She had become known as someone who listened carefully without taking sides too quickly. Friends described her as thoughtful and level-headed, the person who could calm a situation when emotions were running high. Over time, that reputation strengthened. When someone felt hurt by something a partner had said, Claire was the one they called. When a friendship felt strained, Claire was the person who offered to sit down and talk through the problem. She listened patiently while others explained their frustrations, asking questions that helped them reflect on what had happened. In many ways, she became the trusted advisor within that community. People felt comfortable sharing their private concerns with her because she rarely judged anyone openly. Yet as investigators later examined these events more closely, they began noticing something that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Many of the conflicts that tore friendships apart seemed to follow the same sequence. A quiet conversation with Claire would occur first. Shortly afterward, someone would begin questioning something they had previously accepted without concern. That doubt would grow into suspicion, and eventually the relationship would begin breaking down. At the time, no one connected those moments together. Each person believed their concerns had developed independently from their own experiences. Claire appeared supportive during every step of the process, listening calmly while people worked through their frustrations. From the outside, she looked like the one person helping everyone make sense of difficult situations. Yet hidden beneath those conversations was a pattern that would only become visible later. Because although the arguments and misunderstandings felt different for every person involved, they often began with the same quiet interaction. And at first, no one noticed the pattern. The moment the pattern began to reveal itself did not come from an investigator or a dramatic confrontation. It began with someone who had once been close to Claire. His name was Daniel. Daniel had known Claire for years, and like many others in that small American town, he had trusted her without much hesitation. She had been present during several difficult moments in his life, listening patiently when he struggled with personal decisions and offering thoughtful comments that seemed to help him see situations more clearly. For a long time, Daniel believed Claire was simply someone who cared deeply about the people around her. But as time passed and several friendships within their social circle began falling apart, Daniel started noticing something that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Conversations he had with different friends seemed to contain strangely similar details. Someone might describe how they began questioning a partner after a quiet discussion with Claire. Another friend might recall a moment when Claire gently suggested reconsidering something that had been said during an earlier argument. None of these memories seemed alarming on their own, yet Daniel began realizing that many conflicts shared the same beginning. A conversation with Claire had happened shortly before the tension appeared. Curious about whether this connection meant anything, Daniel began speaking with a few people he had not talked to in months. He asked simple questions about when their disagreements had started and what had led them to see situations differently than before. At first, those conversations felt ordinary, but as more stories emerged, the similarities became impossible to dismiss. Several people remembered Claire asking careful questions that caused them to reflect on things they had previously ignored. Others described moments when Claire had expressed gentle concern about a comment or action that later became the focus of an argument. Piece by piece, those accounts began forming a clear pattern. Claire had not openly accused anyone of wrongdoing, and she had never told someone to distrust a partner or friend. Instead, she had introduced small ideas that encouraged people to re-examine their relationships from a different perspective. Those ideas often appeared as quiet suggestions delivered with concern rather than certainty. When Daniel finally laid those stories side by side, the realization became unavoidable. Claire was not simply helping people resolve their problems. She was quietly shaping the way those problems were understood. The method itself was subtle and consistent. First, there would be a conversation where someone shared personal worries or frustrations. Claire would listen carefully, offering emotional support that made the person feel safe continuing the discussion. Then she might ask a thoughtful question or make a gentle observation that introduced a new interpretation of events. After that, she often allowed silence to fill the conversation, giving the other person time to consider the possibility she had raised. That silence proved surprisingly powerful because it allowed doubts to grow without anyone appearing responsible for them. As Daniel reflected on those interactions, he realized that Claire rarely repeated the same suggestion twice. She did not need to. Once someone began questioning a relationship, their own thoughts would continue expanding that doubt long after the conversation ended. Looking back, Daniel could see the same sequence repeating across several friendships. Small suggestions, emotional support, strategic silence. Each step looked harmless on its own, yet together they created a powerful influence over how people interpreted their experiences. By the time Daniel understood what had been happening, many relationships had already changed beyond repair. And what disturbed him most was not simply the possibility that Claire had been guiding those conversations deliberately. The most disturbing realization was something else entirely. It was how easily the entire process had worked. By the time Daniel finished piecing together the stories he had gathered from former friends and neighbors, the explanation that slowly emerged felt unsettling in a way that no single argument or misunderstanding could explain. For years, the people around Claire had trusted her completely because she appeared caring, thoughtful, and patient. She listened longer than most people were willing to listen, and she rarely judged anyone openly when they described their frustrations. That reputation created a powerful sense of trust that few people ever questioned. Yet Daniel began realizing that this trust had also created the perfect environment for something far more subtle. The most effective manipulation is often invisible precisely because it never appears forceful. Claire never demanded that anyone believe her interpretation of a situation. She never ordered people to end friendships or question their partners. Instead, she offered ideas gently and allowed the other person's mind to carry those ideas forward. When someone believes a thought belongs to them, they defend it far more strongly than if it had been suggested directly. That realization explained why the influence had spread so easily through the town's social circles. Each person believed their concerns had developed naturally from their own observations. They replayed conversations in their minds and found small details that seemed to confirm the doubts they now carried. By the time those doubts reached the surface of their relationships, the original conversation with Claire felt distant and unrelated. No one felt they had been persuaded to think differently because they believed the conclusions were their own. As Daniel reflected on everything he had learned, he understood that Claire had never needed to control anyone's actions directly. Instead, she had guided the way people interpreted events around them. A short pause during a conversation could suddenly feel disrespectful. A harmless comment might be remembered as an insult. Once that shift in interpretation took hold, people reacted accordingly, believing their responses were reasonable reactions to what they now believed had happened. Looking back, the pattern became painfully clear. Claire had not forced decisions or demanded loyalty. She had quietly influenced the lens through which others viewed their relationships. And once that lens changed, the people around her began rewriting their own stories without realizing where the change had started. In that way, Claire had never needed to control people's actions at all. She had simply controlled how they interpreted reality. Looking back on everything that happened in that small American town, the story of Claire leaves behind a lesson that is both unsettling and difficult to ignore. Because the most dangerous manipulators rarely appear dangerous at all. They do not raise their voices or threaten anyone directly. Instead, they look supportive. They appear thoughtful during difficult conversations. They offer advice when people feel uncertain and listen patiently when others share their struggles. To the people around them, they seem like the most understanding person in the room, someone who genuinely wants to help others see situations more clearly. That was exactly how Claire was seen for years by friends who trusted her completely. Yet the deeper truth Daniel eventually discovered was that influence does not always look like control. Sometimes it appears as guidance. Sometimes it appears as concern. And sometimes it hides within the quiet suggestion that changes how someone remembers a conversation or interprets another person's actions. When those small shifts in perception accumulate over time, entire relationships can change without anyone realizing how the process began. That realization raises an important question worth thinking about long after this story ends. If someone in your life constantly encourages you to doubt everyone around you, but never encourages you to question their own perspective, what might that say about their intentions? Let me know in the comments, have you ever encountered someone like this? And if you want more psychological stories like this one, subscribe for the next case.